Ninth graders, it's good to see you today. We're going to continue our read of Into the Clouds. And we're going to start actually on page 164. I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. We're going to start at the top of the page, first full paragraph. It was a kind of freedom. It was a kind of freedom, this pure concentration. In danger, you find peace. Maybe this was why they climbed. While Houston rested on his ledge, Bell and Craig probed above him to the edge of the ice field that rose from the top of the pyramid. They tried to find a trace of Wisner's Camp 7 or another spot level enough to pitch their own tents. Now it was late, they were tired, and they needed to get down. As they climbed down to rejoin Houston, Bell chose a foothold on a boulder that looked solid. But when he transferred his weight, the boulder rolled. Bell landed with a thud on the ice and started to slide. Craig yelled a quick warning to Houston and watched with alarm as Bell clawed and scrapped at the slope with his axe. Craig was in no position to waylay Bell. If the rope between them went taut, they would both tumble into free fall down the jagged slope of the Black Pyramid. Finally, Bell's axe dug deep enough and brought him to a stop, face down in the ice. Bell and Craig collected themselves and climbed down to Houston, who had hugged the side of the slope while the boulder careened past, picking up speed as it battered its way down the cliff. Craig was obviously shaken as he told Houston what had happened. Pretty slippery spot was all they could get out of Bell. As they turned to descend the icy rock face, all trace of the quiet satisfaction Houston had felt on the morning climb was gone. His feet and hands were numb from cold. It still took all the concentration he could muster to find holds he could trust and cling to them. But the descent felt like it would never end. By the time they limped into Camp 6 that night, Houston was cold, exhausted, and flirting with frostbite. He collapsed into his sleeping bag and let Bates try to massage his hands and feet back to life. The next day, a storm descended on Camp 6. Trapped in his tent with a bitter wind howling outside, D. Molinar spent the day asking himself a question. What would he sacrifice to get to the top of K2? Like most of his tent mates, he wasn't eating much. Altitude steals the appetite from climbers just when they need the calories most. Molinar figured he was down to 155 pounds. He could see his own ribs. Every day it seemed the weather got worse. Storms had kept them pinned down 4 days out of the last 7. Today, Molinar tried to paint, but he couldn't keep at it. Whenever he set up, the wind-battered tent beat against his head. Despite the weather, the mood in camp was good. Struther told stories about his adventures during the war. Bates was his usual optimistic self. Even today, after nearly losing his feet to frostbite, Houston was full of energy. But everyone knew that the stakes were getting higher by the day. They were down to 18 days worth of food, and they still hadn't found a place for Camp 7. At some point, time would force them to climb in weather like this. And what would happen then? The sun had been out yesterday, and Houston still came back with his feet frozen. Molinar could tell that everyone was asking themselves the same question he was. What exactly would they risk? Just 3 years ago, the French climber Maurice Herzog had answered that question in dramatic fashion near the top of Annapurna. Every climber knew the story well, and right now, with the wind howling outside the tents and Houston's feet still thawing out, it seemed especially relevant to Molinar. Herzog had stood a few hundred feet below the summit of Annapurna when his climbing partner, Louis Lachenal, wanted to turn back. Herzog refused. He was nearly delirious from the altitude. and the summit seemed to him like a sacred quest, an 8,000-meter peak finally within reach. In an hour or two, perhaps, victory would be ours, he wrote later. Must we give up? Impossible. My whole being revolted against the idea. Today we were consecrating an ideal, and no sacrifice was too great. Herzog and Lekanal made it the first climbers ever to stand atop an 8,000-meter peak. Then the descent turned into a nightmare. Herzog lost his gloves, and he was too far gone to realize he could replace them with a spare pair of wool socks. 2 days later, he and Lekanal stumbled into base camp. They had survived an avalanche and a night in a crevasse without a tent. By that time, Herzog's hands and feet were blocks of ice. He had to be carried off the mountain by a relay of Sherpas. Millions of people knew the story's conclusion. By 1953, Herzog's book about Annapurna had become a bestseller. Just before Molinar left in May, the author had been touring the United States telling his story. He limped from event to event, clutching his notes with hands that were little more than stumps. All his fingers and toes had been amputated. That was not the end Molinar had in mind for himself. He made a vow to his diary. Even after months of planning and weeks of effort on the mountain, he would know when to turn around. He could only hope his climbing partners would do the same. If anyone pushed himself beyond his limits, it would place a huge burden on the rest of the team. Bringing an injured man down K2, he wrote, would be an extremely difficult, if not impossible, task. We're going to stop there on page 169, and this is actually a photo of the person, the climber that he's referring to here, Herzog, who climbed Annapurna, and because of the weather and his descent, he lost all of his fingers and his toes. So Molinar is asking himself, what is he willing to risk to make it to the top of K2? And he's stating in his journal anyway, that he's not willing to make that type of risk. See what happens next. Thanks so much, ninth graders. Take care of yourselves now. See you later. Bye.